The Lake Erie chill wasn't a storm. It was a quiet, persistent dampness that settled over northern Ohio like a gray shroud, clinging to the skeletal branches of the oak trees and turning the asphalt roads into black mirrors. It was the kind of morning where the sky wept without emotion. A fitting backdrop for the day Ethan Bishop buried his grandfather. Ethan stood slightly apart from the small group at the graveside, the cold seeping through his dark jacket. He was a man of lean muscle and sharp angles, his face weathered by a sun and sand a world away, making him look older than his 30 years. His posture was unnaturally still, a discipline drilled into him by years as a Navy SEAL. But his eyes, the color of slate gray, were restless, scanning the horizon as if searching for a non-existent threat. At his feet, lying silently on the wet grass, was Shadow. The German Shepherd was a magnificent animal, his black and tan coat sleek even in the damp, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan. He was more than a pet, he was a partner, a silent witness to the horrors and triumphs Ethan had left behind in the desert. Across the polished casket, Ethan's brother, Derek Bishop, was delivering the eulogy. Derek was Ethan's opposite in every way. Where Ethan was weathered, Derek was polished, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit repelling the mist with a casual indifference. He spoke of their grandfather, Arthur Art Bishop, with a practiced, flowing confidence, his voice resonating with a grief that seemed tailored for the occasion. He called Art a pillar of the community, a good man, a patriot. The words were all true, but to Ethan, they felt hollow, like polished stones dropped down a well. Derek hadn't seen their grandfather in 6 months. Ethan, on the other hand, had spent the last 2 months since his discharge sitting with the old man, listening to his rambling stories and watching the light fade from his eyes. He felt a familiar surge of frustration, a low burn in his chest that he quickly suppressed. He reached down, his fingers brushing the top of Shadow's head. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. His presence was a solid, living anchor in the shifting sea of Ethan's emotions. 2 days later, the chill hadn't lifted. It tapped a melancholy rhythm on the 10th floor window of a downtown Cleveland law office. The room was stuffy, smelling of old paper and older coffee. Mr. Wallace, the family attorney, was a man who seemed constructed of the same dry materials as his office. He was thin and precise, with a neat cap of gray hair and spectacles that magnified his pale, dispassionate eyes. He peered at Ethan and Derek over the rims as they sat in the worn leather chairs before his massive mahogany desk. Derek was lounging, one leg casually crossed over the other, radiating an air of impatient success. He checked his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen. Ethan sat erect, his back straight, Shadow again at his feet. The dog's steady breathing was the only sound Ethan focused on, a stable rhythm that kept the walls of the small room from closing in. "Now," Mr. Wallace began, his voice the rustle of dry leaves. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Arthur Elias Bishop." Art was very clear in his instructions. He cleared his throat and began to read from the document. He detailed the small bequests. First, a collection of old fishing lures for a cousin, a donation to the local Veterans Hall. Ethan listened without really hearing. He expected nothing. He and Art had had an understanding, but it had rarely involved material things. Derek, however, leaned forward slightly, the very picture of responsible interest. "To my eldest grandson, Derek Michael Bishop," Wallace read, his tone unchanging. "I leave my primary residence at 214 Elm Street, Cleveland, including all its furnishings and contents. Furthermore, I bequeath to him my entire investment portfolio and the balance of my savings accounts." A small, satisfied smile touched the corner of Derek's mouth. He shot Ethan a quick glance, a mixture of triumph and pity in his eyes. It was as they had both expected. Derek was the responsible one, the successful real estate developer. Ethan was the drifter, the soldier, the one who didn't fit into their neat, predictable world. "And to my youngest grandson, Ethan Cole Bishop," the lawyer continued, turning a page. Ethan braced himself. A token, a handshake, a fond farewell. It was what he expected. "I leave my property in the town of Erie Harbor, Ohio, consisting of the fish shack and the adjoining parcel of land, to include any and all of its contents." There was a moment of silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Erie Harbor. The name was a ghost from a distant childhood memory. A rugged, wind-blasted town on the lake. Fog, the cry of gulls, the smell of fresh water and diesel. The fish shack, a place of summer adventures, had been left to rot for decades. Derek let out a short, sharp laugh, not bothering to hide his amusement. "That old shanty. Seriously, what's he supposed to do with that, Wallace? The thing is one bad winter storm away from collapsing into the lake." Mr. Wallace simply adjusted his glasses. "It was Art's wish. The deed and keys are in this envelope." He pushed a thick manila envelope across the desk toward Ethan. Ethan stared at it, his mind numb. He felt a light pressure on his boot and looked down. Shadow had lifted his head and rested his chin on Ethan's leg, his dark eyes looking up with unwavering loyalty. The simple gesture cut through the fog of confusion. "That's it?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. "That is all," the lawyer confirmed. Derek stood, stretching as though he'd just sat through a boring meeting. "Well, this has been bizarre." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shove. "Listen, Ethan, I'm sorry, I don't know what the old man was thinking, but look, I'll do you a favor. I'll give you $5,000 for it, right now. Take care of the legal mess, and you can walk away with some cash in your pocket. Better than a pile of rotten wood." The offer, seemingly generous, was laced with contempt. It wasn't help. It was a dismissal. Derek saw the fish shack the same way he saw Ethan, as something broken and worthless that needed to be disposed of quickly and forgotten. "No," Ethan said, the word quiet but firm. He stood, taking the envelope from the desk. The keys inside made a faint, metallic sound. "I'll keep it." Derek's smile vanished. He shook his head in disbelief. "Keep it? Why? You going to play fisherman? Come on, be realistic. You need to get your life together, not go hide in some ruin on the coast." "Maybe it's what I need," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. He didn't know why he'd refused. The offer was logical, but something in Derek's smugness, in the casual way he dismissed their grandfather's final gift, had lit a spark of defiance in Ethan's soul. He clipped Shadow's leash to his collar. The dog rose instantly, alert and ready. "Let's go, Shadow." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Derek standing there, momentarily speechless. In the elevator, the silence was heavy. Ethan watched his reflection in the polished steel doors, a stranger in a borrowed jacket. Outside, the city felt loud and suffocating. The hiss of tires, the distant wail of an ambulance, the press of people hurrying through the cold. Every sound was an assault. He walked to his old pickup, a machine as battered and reliable as he felt. Shadow hopped into the passenger seat, circling once before settling down, his eyes never leaving Ethan. Ethan slid behind the wheel, the envelope a dead weight on the seat beside him. He stared through the rain-streaked windshield at the gray city. Derek's words echoed in his head. A pile of rotten wood. Get your life together. He had come home from war to a country he no longer recognized. To a silence that was louder than any explosion. He had lost his team, his purpose, his grandfather. And now he'd been handed a ruin. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe he was just running, hiding. But where else was there to go? He turned the key, the old engine rumbling to life. He glanced at Shadow, at the absolute trust in the dog's gaze. Shadow didn't care about money or real estate or what was logical. He cared about his person. And his person needed a direction. He needed a mission. With a sudden clarity that cut through the grief and anger, Ethan knew what he had to do. He pulled out of the parking garage, not toward the empty house Derek now owned, but toward the interstate heading east. He was going toward the lake, toward a pile of rotten wood in a forgotten town. It wasn't a plan. It was an instinct. It was the only thing he had left. The journey east out of Cleveland was a slow dissolving of one world into another. The gray concrete and steel of the city gradually gave way to the flat, open expanse of northern Ohio farmland. Tall silos stood like sentinels over dormant fields, their metal sides streaked with rust. The sky was a vast, unbroken sheet of gray. Ethan drove with the window cracked, the cold, damp air smelling of wet earth and the distant, clean scent of the Great Lakes, a freshness that began to wash away the stale air of the lawyer's office. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head up, his nose twitching as he sorted the thousands of new smells. For the first time in days, the knot of tension in Ethan's chest began to loosen, replaced by a hollow, uncertain calm. He was driving away from everything he had known, toward a place he remembered only in the hazy fragments of childhood. After 2 hours, the farmland gave way to the coast, and the world changed. Lake Erie appeared before them, a vast, churning gray sea under a matching sky. This wasn't a picture postcard coastline of sunny shores. This was a wild, rugged shore, where dark, jagged rocks battled a relentless chop and the wind carried a perpetual chill. He followed the coastal highway until a faded sign announced his arrival in Erie Harbor. The town was little more than a single street clinging to the edge of a small harbor. The buildings were functional, their brick facades weathered by decades of wind and ice, their roofs streaked with rust. Fishing boats, not yachts, bobbed in the harbor, their nets piled high. It was a working town, a place that had no time for pretense. He pulled up in front of a building with a faded sign that read Erie Harbor General Store. He left Shadow in the truck, promising to be quick. Inside, the store smelled of sawdust, coffee, and brine. A woman stood behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her face a road map of fine lines. She had the steady, observant eyes of someone who had watched the tides of life come and go for a lifetime. This was Brenda, the owner. She watched Ethan as he moved through the aisles, grabbing a lantern, batteries, coffee, and a loaf of bread. She didn't greet him, but her gaze followed his every move. When he placed his items on the counter, she rang them up on an old-fashioned cash register. "New in town?" she asked, her voice dry but not unkind. "Just visiting," Ethan said, his voice clipped. "Bet you're for Old Art's place out on North Point," she said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "Saw the lawyer's car in town last week. Not many other reasons for a stranger to show up here." She bagged his supplies. "Place has a good view, if you can see past the rot." It was the closest thing to a welcome he figured he was going to get. He thanked her and left, feeling her eyes on his back until the door closed. The fish shack was a mile north of town, at the end of a gravel road nearly swallowed by overgrown brush. When he saw it, his stomach sank. Derek hadn't been exaggerating. It was a wreck. The structure listed to one side, its gray wood planks warped and split. Most of the windows were boarded over, and one of the shutters on the upper floor hung from a single hinge, banging a lonely rhythm in the wind. Vines crawled up the walls like green veins, and the air was thick with the smells of low tide and decay. He parked the truck and got out, Shadow at his side. The dog let out a low whine, sensing the wave of despair that washed over Ethan. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a tombstone. Inside was worse. A thick layer of grime covered everything. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and damp rot. In the main room, old furniture was draped in ghostly white sheets, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like funeral bunting. Ethan walked through the small space, his boots crunching on the sand and debris that had blown in through the broken walls. This was a mistake, a giant, stupid mistake born of pride and defiance. He should have taken Derek's money. What was he doing here? He sank onto a dust-covered sofa, the springs groaning in protest. He buried his head in his hands, the weight of his failure, his grief, his entire pointless life crashing down on him. For 2 days, he barely moved. The darkness he'd been holding at bay since coming home finally swallowed him. He slept, but sleep brought no rest, only fractured nightmares of sand and shouting, and the metallic taste of fear. On the second night, the banging of the loose shutter grew more insistent as the wind picked up. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythmic sound drilled into his subconscious, twisting and morphing until it wasn't a shutter anymore, but the thud of helicopter blades, getting closer, too close. He was back in the desert, the air thick with dust, the sun a merciless hammer. The crack of gunfire echoed in his skull, and he snapped awake, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was on the floor, his shirt soaked in sweat, the phantom smell of cordite filling his nostrils. The room was pitch black, the only sounds the howl of the wind and the relentless banging. He was drowning in it. Panic was a cold hand closing around his throat. Then he felt a wet nose press hard against his cheek, followed by a warm, heavy weight on his chest. Shadow. The dog whined softly, not in fear, but with a calm, urgent demand. He licked Ethan's face, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge. Ethan wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in his fur, his own breath coming in ragged, choked sobs. He clung to Shadow as the storm in his mind gradually subsided, leaving only a familiar, bone-deep exhaustion. The dog had done what no person could. He had pulled him back to the present. The next morning, the despair hadn't vanished, but the paralysis was broken. Shadow wouldn't let him wallow. The dog dropped a piece of driftwood at his feet, his tail giving a tentative wag, his eyes demanding action. All right, I get it," Ethan mumbled, his voice hoarse. He pulled on his boots, and they walked out onto the shore. The fog was thick, shrinking the world to a 50-foot circle of gray sand and swirling mist. The roar of the unseen lake was a constant, powerful presence. They walked for miles, two solitary figures against a vast, indifferent landscape. The cold air cleared his head, and the raw power of the place began to soothe the ragged edges of his soul. When they returned to the fish shack, Ethan felt a flicker of resolve. He would not be beaten by this place. He started with the basics, sweeping the sand and debris from the main room. It was mindless work, but it was something. In the back corner of the room, half buried under a pile of old fishing nets, was a heavy canvas tarp, stiff with age and damp. As Ethan went to move it, Shadow suddenly became intensely focused on the space beneath it. He lowered his head, sniffing at one corner, and let out a few short, sharp barks. He began pawing at the tarp, his claws tearing at the brittle fabric. "Easy, boy. What is it?" Ethan said, intrigued by the dog's insistence. He pulled the heavy tarp aside. Underneath, nestled into the dirt floor, was a dark green, military-style footlocker. It was old, with faded stenciling on the side and a heavy-duty lock securing the lid. Ethan stared at it, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through his fatigue. This wasn't just old fishing gear. This was something else entirely. This was his grandfather's. The footlocker sat on the dusty floor, a solid, olive-drab promise of something more than decay. It was a tangible link to his grandfather, Art, a man Ethan realized he had respected more than he had truly known. The stenciling on the side was faded but still legible. A Bishop, followed by a series of numbers and letters that looked like a unit designation, but not one Ethan recognized from his own era of service. The lock that secured it was a heavy brass monster. Its surface had been corroded by decades of damp air into a mottled green. It looked formidable, impenetrable. For the first time since his arrival, Ethan felt a surge not of despair, but of purpose. This was a problem with a physical solution. This, he understood. He spent the first hour searching the shack for tools. In a rotting cabinet near the back door, he found a small, rusted toolbox. Inside was a meager collection: a hammer with a cracked wooden handle, a few bent nails, and a short, sturdy pry bar. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He knelt beside the chest, Shadow watching him with intelligent, focused eyes from a few feet away, as if supervising the operation. Ethan jammed the end of the pry bar into the lock's shackle and threw his weight against it. The metal groaned in protest, a shrill sound in the empty silence of the shack. He strained, his muscles bunching, the frustration he'd been bottling since the funeral channeling itself into this single act of controlled violence. But the lock held firm. The old brass, forged in a different era, refused to yield. He tried again, this time using the hammer to strike the end of the pry bar, hoping to shatter the mechanism. The clang of steel on steel was deafening. Motes of dust danced in the thin beams of light piercing the grimy windows. Still nothing. He threw the pry bar down in frustration, the tool clattering on the floorboards. He paced the room like a caged animal, the walls once again feeling too close. It was another dead end, another locked door in a life full of them. He had come here chasing a ghost, a feeling, and all he'd found was more failure, a lock he couldn't even break. He slid down the wall to the floor, the fight draining out of him. What had he been expecting? Gold bars, old war medals, some grand revelation that would explain the hollow ache in his chest? It was just a box of old junk, one last meaningless puzzle from a dying man. He was ready to give up, to let the box sit there and rot with the rest of the place. But then Shadow, who had been observing his master's growing agitation with a quiet focus, got to his feet. He walked not to the footlocker, but to a seemingly random spot near the center of the room. He circled it once, then lowered his head, his sensitive nose pressed against the wooden floor. A low whine rumbled in his chest. Then he began to scratch, not frantically, but with a deliberate, insistent motion, his claws making a soft scraping sound on the old plank. He looked back at Ethan, whined again, and returned to his scratching. It was specific, unusual behavior. It was the same focus Shadow would show when he scented a hidden explosive, a signal that couldn't be ignored. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan said, his voice low. He got to his feet, his frustration momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep-seated trust in his partner's instincts. He walked over to where the dog was indicating. The floorboard looked just like all the others, warped and gray with age. But when Ethan put his weight on it, it gave a slightly different creak, a hollow sound. He picked up the pry bar again. This time, there was no violence in his movements. He worked the tip of the tool into the seam with a surgeon's care, gently applying leverage. Instead of resisting, the board popped up with a soft click, as if it were designed to be removed. Beneath it was not dirt or empty space, but a small, hidden compartment cut out of the joists. And nestled inside was a shoebox-sized rectangular container wrapped in oilcloth. It was not a standard military box. It was heavy, and as Ethan lifted it out, he felt the distinct coldness of metal. Unwrapping the oilcloth, he found a lead-lined box, the kind used to protect sensitive items from water and electronic detection. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, carefully constructed hiding place. This box had no lock, just two simple clasps. His heart hammered against his ribs as he flipped them open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were a few items. First was another journal, smaller than the one he imagined was in the footlocker. Its leather cover was worn smooth, and the pages were filled with his grandfather's neat, compact handwriting. But this wasn't a diary. The entries were dated, but they consisted of coordinates, weather observations, and cryptic notes like cargo delivered or no contact on scheduled fishing trip. On top of the journal was a set of small, intricate keys on a simple steel ring. They weren't keys for doors. They looked like keys for a safe deposit box or perhaps for winding old clocks or specialized equipment. Beneath everything was a rolled-up pouch, also made of oilskin. Ethan carefully untied the leather thong and unrolled it. It was a map, not a printed nautical chart, but a hand-drawn chart of the Erie Harbor coastline rendered in incredible detail on a piece of treated canvas. The landmarks were familiar, but it was covered in symbols and notations he didn't understand. Arrows pointed to specific coves. Depths were marked in places that should have been unnavigable, and certain rock formations were circled with dates next to them. This was not a map for fishing. It was a map for something else, something secret. He sat there on the floor, the lead box in his lap, the cryptic chart spread out before him. The locked footlocker, which had been the sole focus of his energy just minutes before, now seemed like a secondary concern, maybe even a decoy. The real secrets had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look beneath the surface. He looked over at Shadow, who had sat back on his haunches, watching him with a calm, knowing expression. "You knew, didn't you, buddy?" Ethan whispered, scratching the dog behind the ears. A wave of gratitude washed over him, so powerful it almost knocked him over. His despair hadn't vanished, but it had been transformed into a burning curiosity. This wasn't just his grandfather's old junk. It was a legacy, a mystery handed directly to him. His mission was no longer just to survive the day, but to uncover the truth about the quiet old man who loved to fish. He looked out the grimy window toward the harbor. In the distance, through the mist, he could see a lone figure standing on the docks, mending a net. The man looked as weathered and timeless as the town itself. Ethan watched him for a long moment, a new thought taking root in his mind. He wasn't alone here. There were ghosts in Erie Harbor, and maybe, just maybe, there were still people who kept their secrets. The morning in the fish shack was a quiet affair, marked only by the changing quality of the light as the sun tried to burn through the coastal fog. Ethan had spent a sleepless night, his mind racing, the contents of the lead box laid out carefully on the floor beside his sleeping bag. He was up before dawn, and with a mug of bitter instant coffee in hand, he went back to work. His military training took over, bringing order to the chaos of his thoughts. He treated the logbook and the chart like enemy intelligence to be analyzed, dissected, and understood. He spent hours cross-referencing the cryptic log entries with the hand-drawn chart. The handwriting was his grandfather's, but the language was foreign. Phrases like northern visitor arrived with the tide and package delivered to courier were clearly code. The coordinates listed didn't correspond to any known shipping lanes or fishing grounds. They pointed to desolate stretches of water, dangerous shoals, and secluded, inaccessible coves. He recognized the rhythm of military shorthand, but it was an older dialect from a generation that had fought a different war. It was the language of spies and submariners, not the direct, efficient communication of a SEAL team. He was an expert in a modern war, but this was an echo from an older, colder one. By midday, he had hit a wall. He had a collection of carefully transcribed notes, a list of dates and coordinates, and a chart full of symbols he couldn't decipher. He had the pieces of the puzzle, but he had no idea what the final picture was supposed to look like. He needed a key. He needed local knowledge. Frustration began to gnaw at him, but it was different this time. It wasn't the hopeless despair of before, but the focused frustration of a stalled mission. He walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the working heart of the town. He saw the figure again, the same lone fisherman he'd seen the day before, standing on the docks, his movements patient and methodical. That man was a part of this landscape. If anyone knew the secrets of this coast, it would be him. Approaching a stranger went against every instinct Ethan had honed. Those instincts screamed at him not to trust anyone, to rely only on himself and his team. But his team was gone. It was just him and Shadow, and he was out of options. "All right, Shadow," he said, clipping on the leash. "Let's take a walk." The docks were a symphony of sounds and smells, the cry of gulls, the rhythmic clanging of rigging against metal masts, the low growl of diesel engines. The air was thick with the scent of freshwater, fish, and drying nets. Men in heavy boots and worn overalls moved with purpose, their faces weathered by the same wind and water that shaped the cliffs. They gave a wide berth to Ethan and his formidable-looking dog, their glances a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Ethan felt like an intruder, his military bearing and clean gear marking him as an outsider. He finally spotted the man he was looking for at the end of a pier, sitting on an overturned lobster trap, mending a large net. This was Silas. Up close, He looked as if he were carved from driftwood. His face was sun-darkened, etched with 1,000 lines from a lifetime of squinting into the sun and the lake. A thick white beard covered his jaw, and his hands, though swollen at the knuckles with age, moved with a surprising dexterity as he worked the netting needle. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue, missed nothing. He watched Ethan and Shadow approach without pausing in his work. Ethan stopped at a respectful 10 feet. "Excuse me," he said. Silas didn't look up. "If you're selling something, I'm not buyin'. If you're a tourist looking for a charter, you're in the wrong town." His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in the surf. "I'm not a tourist," Ethan said simply. He stood his ground, waiting. He had learned patience in the worst places on earth. He could wait here. Shadow sat perfectly beside him, his posture relaxed but alert, his gaze fixed on the old man. For a full minute, the only sounds were the scrape of Silas's needle and the cries of the gulls. Then, Silas's hand stilled. He finally raised his head, his gaze sweeping over Ethan and landing on the dog. He observed Shadow's disciplined posture, the calm intelligence in his eyes, the way he stayed close to his handler without needing a command. "That's a serious dog," Silas said, his tone shifting from dismissive to appreciative. "He's my partner," Ethan replied. Silas grunted, a sound of grudging respect. He'd seen countless dogs in his life, but few with that quiet confidence. A dog like that only listened to a man who had earned it. His eyes moved back to Ethan, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw the soldier's stillness, the exhaustion in his eyes, the subtle tension in his shoulders. This was no drifter. This was a man who had been through the fire. "What do you want?" Silas asked, his voice less hostile. "I'm looking for information about a man who used to live here, Arthur Bishop." The name hung in the air between them. Silas's bright blue eyes narrowed, an unreadable flicker passing through them. He stared at Ethan, his gaze intense, probing. "What's Art to you?" "He was my grandfather," Ethan said. Silas set his net down. He looked from Ethan's face to the dog at his feet, and back again. A long silence stretched out, filled only by the sounds of the harbor. He was connecting the pieces, weighing the man before him against the memory of his old friend. "Art's grandson," he finally mumbled, more to himself than to Ethan. He looked out at the lake. "Your grandfather was a hell of a fisherman. Knew these waters better than any man I ever met. Had a knack for findin' things in the fog that other folks missed." Ethan waited, sensing there was more. "He had his own kind of fishing trips," Silas continued, his voice lowering. "Sometimes he'd go out when the storms were so bad no sane man would leave the dock. Said the fishing was best then." He paused, then looked directly at Ethan. He was part of a group, from a long time ago, when the world was dangerous in a different way. They were good men. They helped people, folks who were lost, you might say. Helped them find their way in the dark. The coded words from the logbook flashed in Ethan's mind. Northern visitor, package delivered. It wasn't a fishing club. It was a network, a secret railroad, not for slaves, but for someone else. "The Cold War," Ethan said, the realization dawning. Silas gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Some echoes are louder than others." Art was a quiet man, but he was a deep harbor, held a lot of secrets. He picked up his net again, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "That chart you might have found," he said without looking up. "It ain't for findin' fish. It's for avoidin' what's under the waves. Your granddad wasn't just navigatin' on the water. He was navigatin' through history." With that, he returned his full attention to his work, leaving Ethan standing on the dock with a piece of a puzzle that was bigger and more complex than he could have ever imagined. Ethan walked back from the docks with the lake spray still cool on his face and Silas's cryptic words echoing in his head. He was navigating through history. The phrase reframed everything. As he looked at the fish shack now, he no longer saw a ruin buckling under the weight of time. He saw a silent watchtower, an outpost on the front line of a forgotten war. Every peeling plank and rusted nail was a testament to his grandfather's quiet courage. This place wasn't a burden. It was a post. He unrolled the hand-drawn chart on the dusty floor, the strange symbols and coordinates now carrying a profound new weight. This wasn't just a piece of land. It was a station, a sanctuary. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in him, a feeling he hadn't had since he'd taken off the uniform. He was a guardian again. The low rumble started deep in Shadow's chest a full minute before Ethan heard the car. The dog rose to his feet, his body rigid, a deep-throated growl vibrating in the quiet air. Ethan was instantly on alert, moving to the window. A gleaming black sedan, so out of place it looked like it had landed from another planet, was carefully making its way up the overgrown gravel drive. Ethan's hand went instinctively to Shadow's head in a calming gesture as the car stopped. His brother Derek emerged from the driver's side, his city shoes looking ridiculous on the muddy ground. From the passenger side, another man emerged, older with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. The man wore an expensive gray suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. He surveyed the fish shack with an expression of profound distaste. "Ethan, glad I found you," Derek called out, his voice laced with false cheer. "Figured you'd be hiding out here." He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Marcus Thorne. He's a developer, a colleague of mine. We were in the area and wanted to stop by, see how you were settling in." Mr. Thorne extended a hand, his handshake firm and brief. "A pleasure, Ethan. Your brother tells me you have quite the rustic getaway here." His eyes scanned the property, but he wasn't seeing the history or the rugged beauty of the coast. He was seeing numbers on a spreadsheet, a problem to be eliminated. "Derek was telling me about the unique potential of this particular parcel." They stepped inside the shack, Thorne taking care not to brush his suit against the grimy walls. "As you can see, the structure itself is a complete loss," Thorne said, his voice smooth and practiced. "But the location is unparalleled. We're in the final planning stages for the Lakeside Pinnacle Estates. 18-hole golf course, private marina, luxury spa. This little cove is essential for our waterfront access. We've already acquired all the neighboring properties." He opened his briefcase on a dusty table, revealing architectural renderings of a vast, sterile complex that would obliterate everything Ethan was just beginning to discover. Derek stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Look, Ethan, I know my last offer was a bit hasty. We've had the property properly appraised, considering its strategic value to Mr. Thorne's project." He slid a folder across the table. "This is a real offer. $250,000. Life-changing money, little brother. Enough for you to get a fresh start, get some help, maybe go back to school. We're trying to help you." The condescension in his voice was a physical thing, an insult wrapped in the language of concern. Ethan stared at the number on the paper, then at the confident, predatory smiles on their faces. They saw him as a ragged drifter to be bought off, a sentimental fool standing in the way of progress. He thought of Silas's words, of his grandfather heading out into stormy waters to meet strangers in the dark. He thought of the courage that must have taken, the quiet, unrewarded patriotism that was soaked into the very land beneath their feet, and he felt a cold, hard certainty settle in his soul. "No," he said. The smiles vanished. "No," Derek repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "What do you mean, no? Did you hear the number? This isn't a negotiation, Ethan. This is a winning lottery ticket." "I'm not selling," Ethan said again, his voice quiet but unshakable. Derek's face flushed with anger. He stepped closer, invading Ethan's personal space. "Don't be a fool. This place is worthless. It's a pile of memories and rot. What is wrong with you? Art would have wanted you to take this. He would have wanted you to be practical." He jabbed a finger into Ethan's chest. "You're throwing away your future for a ghost." As Derek's voice rose and he lunged forward, a black and tan shadow moved with blinding speed. Shadow didn't bark or bite. The movement was silent, fluid, and utterly decisive. He planted himself directly between the two brothers, his body a solid, immovable wall. He didn't make eye contact with Derek. He just stood there, his head slightly lowered, and from deep in his chest came a growl, a rumble so low and resonant it seemed to vibrate the floorboards. It was not a sound of aggression. It was a statement of absolute control, a final, non-negotiable warning. Caleb froze, his hand dropping to his side. He looked down at the dog, whose stillness was more terrifying than any bark. He saw not a pet, but a trained soldier, and for the first time, a flicker of fear entered his eyes. The moment broke the spell of intimidation. Bolstered by the unwavering loyalty of his partner, Ethan felt his own resolve harden into steel. He was no longer the lost man from the funeral. He was the guardian of this place, and he would not be moved. "The shack is not for sale," Ethan said, his voice now carrying a quiet authority that made Derek pause. "Not for any price. This conversation is over. You and Mr. Thorne need to leave my property." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, Derek let out a bitter laugh. "Fine, whatever. Be a stubborn fool, but don't think this is over. There are other ways. I'll see you in court. Have you declared unstable, incompetent? You won't win, Ethan." He turned and stalked out of the shack, a flustered Mr. Thorne gathering his papers and hurrying after him. The sleek car roared to life, spitting gravel as it sped away, leaving only the smell of exhaust and the echo of empty threats. Ethan stood in the sudden silence, the adrenaline slowly receding. He reached down and put a hand on Shadow's head, the dog's presence a warm, solid reassurance. The confrontation had been ugly, but it had forged something new in him. He wasn't just uncovering a mystery anymore. He was defending a legacy, and he wouldn't let it be buried a second time. Derek's threat echoed in the silence of the fish shack long after his car was gone. "I'll see you in court." The words were a declaration of war, a new front opened in a battle Ethan was unprepared to fight. He knew his brother. Derek didn't make idle threats. He would use his money, his connections, his slick lawyers to paint Ethan as an unstable veteran, a man incapable of managing his own affairs. And the worst part was, Ethan knew there was a sliver of truth to it. He had scars no one could see. He had moments when the walls closed in, when the past was more real than the present. A courtroom would be a battlefield where his deepest vulnerabilities would be used as weapons against him. He was running out of time. The secret of this place, whatever it was, couldn't stay hidden. He had to uncover the truth, not just for his grandfather, but for himself. He needed something solid, something undeniable to fight back with. His eyes fell on the hand-drawn chart spread on the floor. It was his only lead, a silent set of instructions from a dead man. He studied it with a new urgency, cross-referencing it with the logbook entries. One symbol appeared more frequently than any other, a simple anchor drawn at a small, unnamed cove about 2 miles north of the shack. Next to several of the anchor symbols were dates and the cryptic note "Safe Harbor." It had to be the key. He packed a small bag with a flashlight, the pry bar, a length of rope, and a bottle of water. He folded the precious chart carefully and placed it in a waterproof pouch. "All right, Shadow," he said, his voice low and determined. "Time for a little reconnaissance." The journey was a testament to the wild, untamed nature of the Ohio coastline. There was no scenic trail, no easy path. He had to scramble over massive, moss-covered rocks made slick with lake spray and push his way through dense thickets of thorns. It was rugged, unforgiving terrain that would have been nearly impassable for an ordinary person. But for Ethan and Shadow, it was familiar ground. Shadow moved ahead of him, a silent, sure-footed scout. The dog never got too far, pausing every few minutes to look back and ensure Ethan was following. He moved with an uncanny intelligence, picking the safest path, avoiding loose rocks and sudden drops with an almost human-like instinct. Ethan trusted him completely, placing his boots where the dog had placed his paws, the two of them moving in a fluid, synchronized rhythm. They were a team again, operating in hostile territory, and the familiar sense of purpose was a balm to Ethan's frayed nerves. After nearly an hour of hard trekking, they reached the coordinates marked on the chart. It was a secluded cove flanked on 3 sides by towering black cliffs. The entrance was a narrow, churning channel of water where waves crashed against the rocks with a thunderous roar. It looked inaccessible. A dead end. Ethan consulted the chart again. An arrow pointed to the base of the northern cliff face with a note, "Only at lowest tide." He checked the tide chart he'd picked up at the general store. The water level was dropping. They had a 2-hour window. He sat on a rock, Shadow at his feet, and they waited as the lake slowly retreated, exposing a narrow strip of dark sand at the base of the cliffs. As they made their way onto the newly exposed beach, Shadow's demeanor changed. He became more focused, his nose to the ground, his tail low. He was no longer just pathfinding, he was on a scent. He led Ethan to the sheer base of the cliff, a seemingly solid wall of rock. But Shadow stopped at a place where a thick curtain of green moss and lake vegetation hung down. To the human eye, it was just part of the cliff, but Shadow pushed his nose into the foliage and let out a high, excited whine. He looked back at Ethan, his message clear. "Here." Ethan reached out and pulled the heavy curtain of moss aside. Behind it, almost perfectly concealed, was a dark, narrow opening, a fissure in the rock just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. A cool, dry breeze smelling of earth and stone emanated from the blackness within. With his flashlight in one hand and the pry bar in the other, Ethan squeezed into the opening, Shadow silently at his heels. The fissure opened into a large sea cave, the air surprisingly dry and still. The roar of the lake outside was muffled to a distant, rhythmic boom. The flashlight beam cut through the absolute darkness, revealing a space that was not entirely natural. The floor was level, and the walls in some places showed signs of having been widened and smoothed. This was a place that had been used, and used for a long time. In the center of the cave sat a stack of old wooden crates, their lids sealed with wax. On one of the walls, someone had driven iron rings into the rock, and in the far corner, covered by a heavy oilskin tarp, was a large metal box. With a growing sense of awe, Ethan approached the crates. He used the pry bar to wrench one open. Inside, packed in dry straw, were tins of preserved food, medical supplies, wool blankets, and several jugs of fresh water. They were old, but they had been carefully stored, ready for use. This was a supply cache, a safe house. He moved to the metal box and pulled the tarp away. It was another footlocker, identical to the one in the shack, but this one was unlocked. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a neatly folded wool blanket, was a small, leather-bound ledger. He opened it, his hand trembling slightly. The first page was dated 1962. The entries were not in code. They were names, dates, and nationalities: Russian, Polish, East German. And next to each name, a single, powerful word: rescued. This was it, the undeniable proof. His grandfather, the quiet fisherman from Erie Harbor, had been part of an unsanctioned, unacknowledged network, a modern-day underground railroad. He had used his knowledge of these treacherous waters to meet Soviet submarines that surfaced in the dead of night, taking on political defectors, scientists, and artists seeking freedom. The fish shack was the first stop, the first taste of safety. This cave, the anchorage, was the holding point, the sanctuary where they waited for the next leg of their journey. He sank to the cave floor, the open ledger in his lap, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the names of the ghosts who had passed through this very spot. He felt a profound, overwhelming connection to his grandfather, a man of immense, silent courage who had risked everything, not for medals or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Derek had called this inheritance a pile of rot. He had been wrong. It was a monument, it was a testament to the extraordinary things ordinary people can do in the service of an ideal. Ethan looked at Shadow, who sat beside him, a silent, steady presence in the sacred dark. He finally had his proof. Now the real fight could begin. The weight of the ledger in his hands was both a comfort and a burden. Ethan had the truth, but the truth was a fragile thing against the kind of power Derek wielded. A story, no matter how profound, would be twisted and dismissed in a courtroom. He needed confirmation. He needed allies. His first thought was Silas. But the old fisherman was a keeper of secrets, not a public crusader. Then he remembered a name his grandfather had mentioned in one of his last lucid moments. A man from his old Veterans of Foreign Wars post, a fellow sailor named O'Malley. Gunny O'Malley knows things, Art had said with a wink. He remembers the currents. Acting on the hunch, Ethan drove to the nearest town with cell service and found the number for the VFW post. He asked for Gunny O'Malley. The man who answered the phone had a calm, steady voice. This was Gunny. He was a former Marine gunnery sergeant who had served in Vietnam, known for his quiet wisdom and his unwavering support of fellow veterans. Ethan, choosing his words carefully, explained that he was Art Bishop's grandson, and that he'd found something important, something that needed to be preserved. He didn't go into detail over the phone, but there was a gravity in his voice that Gunny recognized. They agreed to meet the next morning at a small diner off the coastal highway. Gunny O'Malley was a man whose gentle appearance concealed a lifetime of witnessing the worst of humanity. He had a kind, wrinkled face and a welcoming smile, but his eyes were sharp and perceptive, missing nothing. He listened without interruption as Ethan laid out the story from the will to the confrontation with Derek to the discovery in the sea cave. Ethan was cautious, probing, but Gunny's patient focus put him at ease. Finally, Ethan slid a photo he'd taken of a page from the ledger across the table. Gunny put on a pair of reading glasses and studied the names and dates. A long silence fell. He took off the glasses and looked at Ethan, his expression one of deep, solemn respect. Your grandfather was a braver man than even I knew, he said quietly. This isn't just a story, son. This is a piece of history, an important one, and we can't let it get buried. Gunny offered more than sympathy. He offered a plan. There are people who need to hear this, he explained. Not the media, not yet, but our people. There's a network, an informal one, of vets who are just as lost as you are. People with skills, with honor, who are looking for a mission, something that matters. Before they left the diner, Gunny made 2 phone calls. He spoke in clipped, concise terms, but the message was clear. A brother needed help protecting the legacy of a hero. The first to arrive was a woman named Leah Vance. She pulled up to the fish shack 2 days later in a dusty pickup, a toolbox rattling in the back. A former Army combat engineer with 2 tours in Afghanistan, she was sharp and energetic with a no-nonsense attitude and a smile that could disarm a general. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her handshake was firm. Gunny said you needed a decent foreman, she said, her eyes already assessing the shack's sagging roofline. Looks like he was right. Let's get to work. Soon after, others began to arrive. A retired Marine artillery sergeant with a gift for carpentry, a young Air Force vet who was an electrician. They were a quiet, competent crew, drawn not by the promise of a paycheck, but by the call to a mission. They arrived with their tools and their own ghosts, and together they began the hard work of bringing the fish shack back from the brink. The sounds of hammers and saws replaced the lonely rhythm of the banging shutter. The smell of fresh cut cedar began to overpower the scent of decay. And at the center of it all was Shadow. He seemed to understand that his role had changed. He was no longer just Ethan's partner. He was the guardian of this fragile new community. He became the camp's unofficial therapist. When one of the vets grew quiet and withdrawn, lost in a memory, Shadow would walk over and gently rest his head on their knee, his warm, solid presence a silent comfort. During breaks, he would initiate a game of fetch with a piece of driftwood, his boundless energy breaking the solemnity and reminding them of the simple joy of being alive. He moved among them, a furry, four-legged symbol of unwavering loyalty and service. He became their mascot, their confidant, their living link to the values they were all fighting to preserve. Through the shared labor of sweat and sawdust, a new unit was formed. In the evenings, they would gather around a makeshift fire pit on the shore, drinking coffee and sharing stories. The fish shack, once a symbol of Ethan's profound isolation, was now filled with the warmth of camaraderie. Ethan found himself falling into a leadership role, not by giving orders, but by listening, by working alongside them, by trusting them. He saw the same healing he felt in himself reflected in the faces around the fire. They weren't just rebuilding a structure, they were rebuilding themselves. One evening, as they watched the sun dip below the horizon of the lake, Gunny O'Malley sat down beside Ethan. "We're making good progress," he said, nodding toward the newly reinforced porch. "This place will stand for another 100 years, but a strong foundation won't stop your brother's lawyers. To truly protect this place, to make it untouchable, we need official recognition. We need to turn this story into history." He handed Ethan a folded piece of paper. On it was a name and a phone number. "Professor Alistair Finch," Gunny said. "He's a military historian at Ohio State. Specializes in Cold War covert operations. He's the best. He's discreet, and he owes me a favor. It's time to bring in the big guns." Ethan looked at the name. Then back at the fish shack, now bathed in the soft, golden light of sunset. His team was assembled. The post was being secured. It was time for the next phase of the mission, to ensure that the legacy of the anchorage would never be threatened again. The phone call to Professor Alistair Finch felt like stepping into another world, one of academic protocols and careful language. But when the historian arrived a week later, Ethan found not a stuffy academic, but a man with an almost boyish, infectious enthusiasm for the past. Professor Finch was a man in his 50s with a rumpled tweed jacket, a shock of unruly gray hair, and eyes that lit up with a brilliant curiosity. He arrived with a small team, and as Ethan led them first to the fish shack, and then, at low tide, to the sea cave, Finch's excitement was palpable. He held the ledger with the reverence of a priest holding a sacred text, his fingers tracing the names of the defectors. "This is monumental, Mr. Bishop," Finch said, his voice hushed with awe inside the cave. "This isn't just local history. This is a significant, undocumented chapter of the Cold War, a civilian-run rescue network of this sophistication. It's the stuff of legends." Professor Finch and his university moved with surprising speed. His preliminary report, authenticated with cross-referenced naval archives and declassified intelligence, landed like a bombshell. It validated every detail of Art's secret life. Armed with this official documentation, Ethan's lawyer sent a copy to Derek's legal team along with a petition filed with the State Historic Preservation Office to have the property designated a protected site. The response was swift. Faced with irrefutable proof and the prospect of a humiliating public fight against the legacy of a certified war hero, Derek's lawsuit quietly collapsed. A week later, Ethan received a short email from his brother. It contained no apology, but it said, "Art would have been proud. Don't screw it up." The battle was over. A year later, the salt-stained walls of the fish shack stood straight and true. The roof was sound. New windows and a fresh coat of dark blue paint protected the old wood from the lake. A simple, hand-carved sign hung over the porch that read Bishop's Landing. It was no longer a ruin or a private residence. It was a living monument, a non-profit sanctuary for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. The transformation was not just physical, but spiritual. The air of decay was gone, replaced by the smells of sawdust, brewing coffee, and the faint, ever-present scent of the lake. Ethan stood on the restored porch, watching a group of 4 new vets arrive. He was a different man from the haunted soldier who had first come here. The restlessness in his eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady gaze. He greeted them not as a commander, but as a peer, shaking their hands and welcoming them home. Leah Vance, now the full-time executive director, was there to give them the tour, her energetic presence putting everyone at ease. In the main room, now used as a common area, Gunny O'Malley was speaking quietly with a young veteran, sharing a story. The place was filled with a quiet, therapeutic energy. And the heart of that energy was Shadow. He had become the soul of the landing. As the newcomers settled in, looking uncertain and guarded, Shadow moved among them. He seemed to have a sixth sense for pain. He walked over to a young man sitting apart from the others, his hands clenched into fists. Shadow didn't jump up or demand attention. He simply lay down at the man's feet and let out a soft sigh, a simple gesture of companionship that said, "I'm here. You are not alone." Later, he would accompany another vet on a long, silent walk along the beach. His steady presence, a comfort that required no words. For so many who came here, learning to trust again began with trusting the unconditional loyalty of the dog. He was the bridge back to the world. That evening, Ethan sat in an old armchair by the fire, the same chair his grandfather used to sit in. He was writing in a new logbook, not one of secrets, but of the daily life of the landing. He detailed the progress of the vets, the repairs on the old fishing boat they were restoring, the simple, profound moments of healing he witnessed every day. He looked up as Shadow trotted over and rested his heavy head on his knee, his warm brown eyes reflecting the firelight. Ethan stroked the dog's noble head, a wave of gratitude washing over him. He once thought he had come here to uncover his grandfather's story, but he now knew the truth was deeper than that. He had come here to find his own. Bishop's Landing was more than a legacy he was protecting. It was the mission that had saved him. It had given him a new team, a new purpose. It had taught him that the deepest wounds aren't healed in silence and isolation, but in community, in shared work, and in the quiet courage of starting over. He looked at his loyal partner, the dog who had pulled him from the darkness of his own mind and led him to this place of healing. Shadow hadn't just found a secret compartment in the floor. He had found the hidden path to Ethan's own heart. He wasn't just a good dog. He was grace in the shape of a shepherd. The post was secure. The legacy was safe. And for the first time since he could remember, Ethan Bishop felt the deep, unshakable peace of being in his home harbor.